Our review of the case was the case of Margie Velma Barfield, a serial killer in North Carolina.
She was born Margie Velma Billard in rural South Carolina, but grew up near Fayetteville, North Carolina. She was the oldest daughter of 9 children, and her father was Murphy Billard and her mother was Lily Billard.
Throughout her childhood, Velma acted as a mother figure for her siblings. She would clean the house, make meals, wash, iron, and mend clothes, and take care of her siblings. It was her caring nature that earned her the nicknames of Death Row Granny and Mama Margie during her time spent in prison. Her family was one of modest means, and she lived on a small farm. Since her family was so large, she had to share a bedroom with her mother and father.
Velma's father sexually abused her throughout high school, but she was able to escape this abuse and her family home when she married after high school to sweetheart Thomas Burke in 1949 when she was just 17 years old. The two dropped out of high school together. Velma had 2 children with Thomas, a son named Ronnie and a daughter named Kim.
Velma had a hysterectomy and developed severe back pain as a side effect. She was prescribed painkillers and eventually became addicted to prescription medication. Velma also experienced depression as a side effect of her hysterectomy. This only fueled her abuse of prescription medication. After Thomas's death in 1969, Velma remarried to Jennings Barfield in August of 1970. Barfield died under a year later in March of 1971. Velma then met her boyfriend Stuart Taylor when she was taking care of Montgomery and Dolly Edwards. Stuart was Dolly's nephew and met Velma at the Edwards family home. Velma learned that him and his wife were getting a divorce and decided to pursue romantic interests. Velma's criminal history started when she was a child. She would steal pocket money from her father so that she could buy herself luxury items at school. She even went so far as to steal $80 from one of her neighbors. When her father found out, he beat her severely and stopped her from stealing any more while she was a child.
After becoming addicted to prescription medication, Velma found herself needing money to fuel her habits. She returned to stealing and forging checks by using the money of those that were close to her. In December 1974, Velma wrote 5 bad checks using a closed account from her deceased husband, Jennings Barfield. The police warned her that she needs to pay back these bounced checks. However, she was unable to do so. As a result, she is arrested and placed in jail. She was originally sentenced for 6 months, but got out after 4 for good behavior.
Velma did feel remorse for stealing from her loved ones, so she began to slowly poison them because, as she said, she wanted to only make them sick for long enough for her to eventually pay them back before they noticed the missing money. This plan never worked out, though, because Velma would always end up killing her victims, and her method of choice was to mix either arsenic or rat poison into their drinks.
Here is a list of Velma's victims. The first one was Thomas Burke. Velma made Thomas' murder look like a total accident. As the story goes, Thomas suddenly dropped a burning cigarette after passing out drunk. He died from smoke inhalation while their home was burned to the ground. Neither Velma nor her children were harmed during this accident. When Thomas's body was exhumed after her trial, traces of arsenic were found, but she denied killing him. After Thomas, it was Jennings Barfield. Afraid that Jennings would leave her, Velma poisoned him with arsenic, and he later died in the hospital. Then came Lily Billard. 1 week after Lily received an overdue notice for her loan that Velma took out without her knowledge, Velma went and purchased a bottle of poison. She gave a dose to her mother, and as her mother's symptoms worsened, she eventually went with her mother to the hospital in an ambulance. Lily later died in the hospital. Velma confessed to this murder in her trial for Stuart Taylor's death.
After her mother, Velma killed Montgomery and Dolly Edwards. Velma was hired to be a live-in caretaker for Montgomery because his wife Dolly was too feeble to take care of him. Montgomery was blind and an invalid. Montgomery died in his home, and a couple months after his death, Velma went out and purchased poison to kill Dolly as well. Velma confessed to the murder of Dolly in her trial for Stuart Taylor's death. After these two was John Henry Lee. Velma was also a live-in caretaker for John Henry, and after forging a check from him, she poisoned him to prevent him from finding out. He died later after experiencing prolonged pain. This was also another murder that Velma confessed to in her trial for Stuart Taylor's murder. Lastly, the only victim that she was tried for the murder of was Stuart Taylor. Velma and Stuart were dating and living together. Velma stole numerous checks from him and eventually bought a bottle of poison to prevent him from finding out what she had done. Velma and Stuart rode in an ambulance to the hospital after he developed severe symptoms, and he died in the hospital. The investigation yielded two major pieces of physical evidence. The first was the autopsy results. The medical examiner had found traces of arsenic in Stuart Taylor's body after his death. The second was the forged checks. The prosecution presented the forged checks that showed there was a difference between the handwriting on them and the handwriting of Stuart Taylor. The anonymous tip that resulted in the autopsy of Stuart Taylor's body. This tip is what fueled the investigation. An anonymous caller called in and told the police that they had seen Velma poisoning Stuart Taylor's drink. It served as a starting point in the investigation and led to the discovery of the physical evidence of murder.
Velma's relationship with Taylor resulted in her arrest. The two were dating, and the relationship became rocky when Taylor learned that Velma has been previously incarcerated. Velma was the only one that had easy access to Stuart's food and drink. Velma was also one of the only ones who had access to Stuart's checkbook. Velma ended up confessing to the murder of Taylor after the police questioned her.
The jury had no difficulty in reaching a verdict in Velma's case. Velma's attitude in court is what is said to have sealed her fate. The jury found her guilty of the first-degree murder of Stuart Taylor, but she was not convicted of any of the other murders to which she had confessed during the trial. The jury also recommended the death sentence due to the aggravating circumstances under which Taylor was killed. There were multiple experts that testified at the trial for both the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution had medical professionals testify to Taylor's cause of death and the suffering that he faced prior to his death as a result of the arsenic poisoning. The prosecution also called a handwriting analyst who testified that the handwriting on the forged checks did not match those of Stuart Taylor. The defense also had medical professionals testify on their behalf. These professionals testified to the physiological and psychological effects of the prescription medications Velma was abusing. These professionals testified to the condition that Velma was in was most likely due to her abuse of these medications, and because she was prone to mixing medications, she may not have been sane at the time of the crime. The defense also called a psychiatric expert to testify to Velma's sanity at the time of the crime. This expert was part of the defense's argument that she was not guilty by reason of insanity.
For Velma's execution, Velma was imprisoned at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, in an area for escape-prone prisoners and the mentally ill, as there was no designated area for women under the death penalty, and at this time, she was the state's only female death row inmate. Under North Carolina law, Velma was given a choice between execution by lethal gas or lethal injection. She chose lethal injection. Her last meal consisted of Coca-Cola and cheese doodles. She also wore her own pink pajamas for the execution and was made to wear a diaper. She was pronounced dead at 2:15 a.m. on November 2nd, 1984.
Here are our opinions about the case. In my opinion, I believe that the motive for Velma's crimes were her drug addiction and depression. Her depression was a trigger for her crimes because her coping mechanism was abuse of prescription medication. Velma defrauded her victims in order to pay for this prescription medication that she had become addicted to. When she realized she couldn't pay them back, it resulted in their death. I also believe that Velma's trial was not fair because the public defender she was appointed to had no prior experiences with cases in which the death penalty was involved. The case the defense presented did not seem to be effective as the public defender's strategy included her confessing to other murders on the stand. Also, the police recorded a confession from Velma without the presence of a lawyer. She did not know that she was allowed to have a lawyer present, which was a violation of her constitutional rights. I think that the investigation, however, was highly effective in that it produced damning evidence linking Velma to the death of Stuart Taylor. The anonymous tip the police received was followed through and proved to be correct because of the presence of arsenic in Taylor's body, post-mortem indicating poisoning. The police properly investigated those who were close to Taylor by starting with Velma. I found how the public viewed Velma prior to the trial to be very interesting. Most people were shocked to find out what she had done because the way that she portrayed herself gave no indication of violence. People saw her as a matronly woman who shopped at the A&P food market and worked spinning yarn. After all, the woman was a grandmother. Velma also made sure to keep up appearances by attending the funerals of all her victims, making sure to play the role of a grieving spouse, child, or caretaker. The other aspect of this case that I found interesting was Velma's nonchalance at her trial. It is said that she had an attitude of sarcasm and sass throughout the trial, even giving the prosecutor a silent clap after he finished his closing argument. This surprised me because after all of the effort that she had done to keep up her appearance, it seemed that she was giving up easily during her trial. I feel that the defense should have handled the case differently. The strategy used was not effective at all. Having her admit to previous murders most surely implicated her in the murder of Taylor, and the defense should have better counseled her on how to behave in the courtroom. The only aspect of the defense that was, in my opinion, a good decision was the case that she was not guilty by reason of insanity, due to her constant abuse of prescription medication.
For my opinion, I also had the motivation being associated to money and her drug use. She was using the money from her victims, and she put it forth to her drug addiction with the prescription medications. I thought the trial was fair because the defense represented her well, and the prosecution had concrete evidence relating her to the crime. I also thought that there was adequate evidence provided with the autopsy after finding the traces of arsenic and rat poison, and then the anonymous tip that was provided by the random person. With this case, I found her trial attitudes interesting, with the clapping that she did after the defense, after the prosecution said what they had to say, and the sarcasm used throughout the trial. I thought that the defendant's strategy could be improved because the defense never defended someone for the death penalty and made her confess to 3 other deaths of similar circumstances. For Velma's legacy, we found some interesting things. There was books. Jerry Bledsoe wrote Death Sentence, a book detailing Velma's life and her time on death row, and Velma wrote a memoir entitled Women on Death Row. There was shows. The story of Velma Barfield was featured on an episode of Monsters and Murders.
There was also a particular song written about her. Singer-songwriter Jonathan Bird, who was the grandson of Jennings Barfield and his first wife, wrote his song Velma, which is featured on his Wildflowers album, giving a personal account of the murderers and the investigation. Also, Velma is known as a woman of firsts. She was the first woman executed since 1962. She was the first woman executed since the reintroduction of the death penalty in 1976, and she was also the first woman to be executed by lethal injection. Here you will find our references for this presentation. Thank you for watching. We hoped you learned about Velma.